My name is Sue Riddlestone. I'm the Chief Executive of Bioregional, who are one of the partners in creating the Sustainable Building Materials Hub with the UN Environment Programme and the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. And I'm your moderator for today. We have some presentations about the hub, and then we will have, so I will introduce why is it important for us to think about building materials. Then Mohammed from United Nations Environment Programme will take us through the hub, the context, the purpose and the objectives. Stewart Muir from Bioregional will give us a technical perspective on the functionality and the user experience. And Nicholas Ramirez from Costa Rica Green Building Council will provide an end user perspective. Then we've got plenty of time at the end for questions and answers discussion. And so do put your questions in the chat and we will aim to field them as we go along. Okay, so just to begin, why is it important for us to talk about building materials in what is Green Building Week? Next slide, please. So we've heard from the Secretary General that we, more than ever, he sounds more urgent every year, we really have to take action on reducing climate impacts and addressing our resource consumption. And building materials, you can see in the slide here on the little graphic, buildings and construction are responsible for 37% of global carbon dioxide emissions, which is huge. And building materials themselves contribute 9% of that. So that's 9% of total global carbon emissions are being created by our construction materials. And construction materials consumption is actually set to double by 2060 as well. Now, it's been shown that material efficiency strategies can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80 to 100%. So there's plenty of room for improvement. Next slide, please. And we have all been doing a brilliant job at tackling operational carbon emissions. So that's the energy that we use to heat and light our buildings, but we haven't addressed embodied emissions of materials fast enough. So you can see this chart here from the Yale study, and Yale have been partners in this initiative, which shows that you can see 2021 on the left-hand side, and then by 2050, you can see that the embodied carbon of the materials, if we carry on as we are, will make up a much larger proportion of the carbon emissions of the buildings and building sector. So this is something that we urgently need to take action on, because the choice of construction materials affects every aspect of the building's carbon footprint. But we also need to think about resource consumption. So you can see from this chart here from the OECD that the construction materials dominate resource consumption. You can see at the top there, sand, gravel and crushed rock, the steel, the metals we use to build our buildings, limestone in terms of that's needed to make cement, wood. So you can see that the construction industry, and if you think about it, if you look around you as we go about our days, you can see, well, basically, yeah, it's buildings, it's where all the material is. So this is really a very, very important issue. And so we're delighted to welcome you all here today to talk about this because, next slide, please. This is a challenge for policymakers and the hub is very much dedicated to providing solutions for policymakers. So 50% of the buildings that will be standing in 2060 have not yet been built. So this is a fantastic opportunity to do it better, to improve the circularity in terms of the resource use in the buildings, the embodied impact of the carbon. And you can see from this chart here how what we need is to reduce the high embodied non-renewable in grey there in terms of building materials and grow more use of timber, recycled materials and bio-based materials. So I'm delighted, having told you all about the imperative there, to hand over to Mohammed from United Nations Environment Programme, who is the Programme Manager of the Life Cycle Initiative based in Paris, France. And she has been chair of the Materials Working Group on this project. So Mona works on increasing access to life cycle assessment data and knowledge, and works closely with the building, construction and mining sectors. And Mona's background is in environmental engineering and women and gender studies. And before joining the UN, Mona worked as a WASH advisor, so water and sanitation, supporting the humanitarian response in Yemen and Sudan. So over to you, Mona, to share with us a little bit more about the background to the hub and its purpose. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. And really happy to be here today and to finally be launching the Materials Hub, which has been long in the making. So really happy to be here and very glad to see quite a lot of people from the GlobalABC, from the Materials Working Group, and I'm just thrilled that we're finally here today. So on the next slide, I'm going to start with giving you a little bit of an introduction to the hub. And this hub, you know, as Sue has already mentioned, is a result of the work between the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction and Bioregional. It was really funded by the BMZ, the German Ministry of Development Cooperation, as part of a project called the Transforming the Built Environment Through Sustainable Materials. This project works in 4 different countries, India, Ghana, and Senegal, and aims to support these 4 countries to promote circularity in buildings by creating and enabling frameworks for the responsible acquisition of building materials, while developing a sustainable materials market for the buildings and construction sector. Beyond working specifically with these countries, the project also looks to highlight the importance of sustainable materials in high-level international processes. And as part of that mission and the mission of GlobalABC to support governments, to support policymakers, and to advocate for the decarbonization of the building and construction sectors, the Materials Hub became a really important next step for us to make sure that all the resources are available to different actors. And that's where the idea for the Building Materials Hub came. We recognize that we have a lot of partners across the globe who work on this, and they put in a lot of work into this and a lot of resources. And the idea was to bring all of that together into one platform where different users and specifically policymakers are able to come and access these resources. And so again, this is in line with the GlobalABC's mission and meeting the Paris Agreement goals, and finally, the alignment on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So on the next slide. Yeah, like I was saying, the primary target audience here are policymakers, but we do work with everybody along the value chain of buildings and construction. And so we have resources also for academia, civil society, private sector, etc. And the hub really is looking at different geographical contexts. And so we've tried to categorize the different resources by different geographical locations, as well as making sure that we're bringing everybody together. We're not reinventing the wheel. The main background pages of the hub, as well as the different pages of the hub, have built a lot on the text that has been developed by the colleagues in the Yale Center for Environment and Architecture. And on the next slide, you'll see that a lot of the work that we did, a lot of the language that's on the hub actually comes from this materials report, which was launched yesterday. So this report really looked at the state of play in different, well, all over the world, but especially focused on the 4 different countries mentioned previously in the project with deep dive case studies. And it really focused on the state of play for the climate and resource consumption impacts of buildings and construction. And from there, we're working, well, the report also looked at setting out a roadmap for decarbonization profiles by looking at different building materials and what the transition to new materials might look like. So I really like the slide that and the graph that Sue used, because it has an image of where we start today in terms of the mix of different materials that we use in buildings and construction and where we should be in 2060 if we want to continue to decarbonize the sector. The report also looked at different profiles of technological advances and new business models for the buildings and construction sector, and as well as introduced emerging tools for data analysis and decision making. So all of this was quite useful for the Materials Hub and for us as background material as we were putting together the information in the Materials Hub. On the next slide, we'll take a bit of a deeper dive and maybe 2 key messages from the report, as well as 2 objectives of the Sustainable Materials Hub. So first, the hub promotes a whole life cycle approach, which again was also quite an important key message in the report, where the impacts of material choices on human health and well-being, climate and ecosystems have to be considered before these materials are even extracted. And then again, at each phase of the building life cycle, from extraction to processing, installation, use, and demolition. And then for all of this, of course, it's really important to have access to reliable information, verification, and coordination across the different stakeholders in the sector. And that would include manufacturers, architects, engineers, builders, and recyclers. And that is what the hub, in a way, was also hoping to achieve by bringing the different resources together. And then, of course, the 3 strategies that the hub tries to push forward are the Avoid, Shift, Improve framework published by PEEB. And there we're looking to avoid building or building with less when possible through designing better. And that would include considering local value chains, not building or reconceptualizing our use of buildings before we actually decide on whether or not to be building new buildings. On the second prong of this framework, we're looking to shift to the use of alternative building materials. And again, it'd be necessary to develop different supply chains, look at the certification of products and standardize these processes, as well as mainstreaming these alternative materials. And we, of course, understand that concrete and steel are here, and they will continue to be a big part, or to make a big part of the materials mix in buildings. And so it's really important to improve these conventional materials and decarbonizing them. And that starts first by looking at the energy used for their production and improving the efficiency, as well as innovating in the different processes for producing these materials, and wherever possible, substituting some of these materials with natural fiber. So this was the objectives of the hub. On the next slide, you see we're moving on to the consultation process. And this has been a long process. We started in late 2021 with a global stakeholder group where Bioregional started the first consultation and drafted an initial paper as to what might be useful in this hub. And then from there, we started the work in June 2022, scoping the first iteration of the hub and building the map of the hub. And then we continued to, and that was also around the same time that the GlobalABC launched the Materials Hub, which provided a sounding board to Bioregional as this work kept on developing. And the working group included members from the global building councils, different associations and NGOs, industry, universities, architects, tool developers, and material certification programs. So we really tried to have as wide a reach as possible. And we had discussions on these 6 different things on the screen, but really they can be divided around 2 things. The first 3 points focused on the look and feel of the hub. Who did we expect to use this hub? How can we best reach them? And what would their user journey look like? And how can we make this information available as easily as possible in terms of the taxonomies used and the resource categorization? The second part of this discussions that we had focused on the continuation of this hub and ensuring that it continues to stay relevant. So conversations about updating the content on regular basis and encouraging encouraging input from people outside the group to provide their reports into the hub is also one thing we discussed, as well as what would the governance and maintenance of the hub look like moving forward. So on the next slide, there's a bit more details on the timeline that we had. Looking at the different phases we looked at, but most important thing is we started in 2022. We had a beta version by December 2022, and then we were able to add all the content from the Yale study in the last couple of months, and we are finally launching today. So this has been a long time coming, and we're happy we're finally here. And finally, on the last slide, the next steps for the hub. So of course, we continue to the Sustainable Materials Working Group, which in a way, which supported the development of this hub, will continue to support it and upload different resources, and the governance of the hub will come from the Sustainable Materials Working Group. So if this is a group of interest to you, please feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to add you to our mailing list and to the different working groups. And then, of course, we'll continue to scour the internet and do regular reviews to ensure that if there are any relevant resources, we're adding them. And finally, as this is a project that's been supported by BMZ, and as the project continues to develop in the different 4 countries and is being implemented by UNEP in collaboration with UNOPS and UN Habitat, we will continue to populate the hub with other resources as these become available. And we really hope this will be used by different countries as they're developing their NDCs, nationally determined contributions. But yeah, so thank you for being here and thanks for having this moment to talk about that.
Thank you very much, Mona. So we've heard about the imperative, why construction materials are important, being 9% of global carbon emissions and the biggest contributor to our material resource footprint. So this is an urgent mission, and thank you for joining the call today to find out more about the hub. And so now we're going to hear from Stewart Muir, who is a senior technical expert at Bioregional, who specialises in materials and products and has a background in environmental chemistry and energy. And Stewart has led Bioregional's work with UNEP. That has included several other projects alongside this one, including writing the Eco-Innovation Supplement on building materials and various guidances on improving the chemical safety of building materials. So we're in the hands of a building materials expert who's going to give you a walkthrough of the hub, the functionality and the user experience. Over to you, Stewart.
Thank you, Sue. Okay, so we will go through a quick whistle-stop tour of the hub and the functionality that it can provide and what we have attempted to develop as a good user experience that we've worked on and consulted on during the meetings with the Sustainable Materials Working Group. So the hub has, as has been mentioned, we have 5 sort of key areas of the hub where we've featured some key background information to the topic of sustainable building materials. We've split this up by policy challenge, information on taking a life cycle approach to improving the sustainability of materials in the buildings. We have a section, a main page on climate, which gives information on ensuring a climate appropriate approach to designing buildings and material selection. From our consultations, we thought a area on building use would be a good way and a good initial entry point for users on the hub. And then we've got a main page on materials as a useful entry point to the hub. So just to show you quickly how the hub looks. So here's our main homepage. Our policy challenge page here has some background information and links to these topics on the menu on the left. So embodied carbon and circularity are 2 main pillars of what we're looking to address with the resources, but also some of these resources do look at things like operational carbon, chemicals and health, climate adaptation, socially responsible sourcing, and topics such as that. Life cycle stage, this is looking to feature resources that encourage the use of this whole approach or tool to enable the full life cycle thinking to be used across procurement as well as assessing environmental impacts. For the way we've split resources on climate, we've decided to use a dry, temperate and tropical split for the different building types. We did consider sort of how many country types or regions we could divide materials by, but we decided in our consultations to keep the classification of these 3 climate types in there. We've gone with the Köppen-Geiger climate classification for this. For building use, again, we include some background here, and building use, we're looking to cover areas related to municipal construction that might relate to sustainable public procurement, commercial buildings, there's some resources related to infrastructure, residential buildings and social housing and informal settlements. And informal settlements are a very important aspect of the hub's resources as there are 1 billion people in the world at the moment who are living in what would be described as informal housing sector. And then finally, materials. This is our final main page. So again, we break down on the page some of the key strategies here on non-renewable materials and also renewable materials. So for example, bamboo here and timber and wood obviously gaining traction as a construction material. So again, we thought this was one area where we would expect there to be this would be a fairly key entry point for users of the hub. So we have resources of different types. So, for example, we have a number of research papers and policy briefs. Here's an example of one of our papers on natural building materials and the social perceptions of bamboo compared to how other building materials like steel might be perceived in terms of the performance, but as well as how they're perceived socially as materials. In terms of the different resource types, and in our consultation, we did take on board that it would be useful for people to have menus and filters around the different types of resource. So we have a number of tools on here. There's an array of tools that we've come across and been suggested to us by working group members and other people who have fed into the hub. So we have tools such as the Building Transparency EC3 tool, which is on here. We have some carbon calculator tools of varying simplicity and complexity on the hub, which have different applications and different geographies where they're intended to be used. I think one thing we really hope to see in the next few years is replication of tools and seeing more free access tools become available, but also finding ways to find a tool that works really well in one place and find ways that can be replicated in other places. There's a number of resources that we would hope are very much directly aimed at policymakers. So there's a number of policy reports and briefings that we have on here. So on the bottom left, we've got the reports from One Click LCA and from C40 Cities and CNCA, which shows a city policy framework for dramatically reducing embodied carbon. So this assesses 52 policies on embodied carbon. Resources that are more in the sort of policy toolkit type. So we've got the Carbon Leadership Forum has a whole policy toolkit for various aspects of policy making, local and national, for reducing embodied carbon. And resources like roadmaps for material decarbonisation would come up on here. We've included a number of case studies, again, very varied in their topics and their applications. So our initial set of case studies includes things like steel reuse cases. We've got some interesting cases of that from the UK we've seen. It's also, we've attempted to be very, very global in the resource at the start, and that's our intention going forward. So, for example, the case study on the bottom right is an example of a hospital built in Bangladesh that was a winner of an award for its climate-focused design and its use of local earth-based materials. And we have a number of other research papers which is intended to support policymakers directly or those who are writing briefs for policymakers and trying to understand what the market is for certain technologies and products. So research papers looking at LCA studies that will hopefully give good data on market assessment. Sustainable design principles is another thing that we've included as well. This the architecture community is very key to this. This community of sustainable building materials, and they're a very big driver of action at their position in the value chain. And also the social aspects, again, is something that we've attempted to include research papers on, and again, perceptions and the uptake of certain building materials, and what some of the emerging trends are going forward in terms of the perceptions of building users, emerging trends in technologies, or emerging trends in new business models. So I'll just briefly go through a few of the sort of user journeys of the hub, because we did quite a lot of user testing of this, and things like how many filters do we think is useful, and where do people start, and how do we want to split things up. So, for example, we've got lots of resources on embodied carbon, and we've split a number of these up. So to sort of come back to a user journey here, if you were to start with the policy challenge page, we think this might be a first port of call for a number of users. So if you are interested in resources on embodied carbon, we've got quite a few on there, but this could be cut down to different areas. So, for example, if we were to split by tool here, we've got a number of tools such as OpenLCA or Athena or Tally, other tools such as the UNEP Eco Innovation Manual, which is a sort of tool in a different sense. Various policy briefs on embodied carbon again. So if we let's filter by this, some resources that get very much into looking at embodied carbon policies and the assessment of these. In terms of research papers, again, we have an initial set of these, but how these would enable policy development. So things like this paper from One Click LCA on carbon footprint limits for common building types. Materials we know would be an initial first port of call, so you can clear all these filters here and go in via materials. So one of the discussions we had, we've just got an initial set of resources here. There certainly will be more going forward, but say if you're interested in cement and concrete, we've included some global resources on cement and concrete, but also some things that may be useful if you are looking for alternatives to cement and concrete. So things like the LC3 project and some of the outputs from that on limestone calcined clay cements. So, for example, if you're looking for, again, research papers, as we've split up here, we know, for example, there's lots of good research papers on things like the MIT Concrete Sustainability Hub. If you were to go into resources here as well, you can see that we've tagged them with the avoid, shift, improve solutions. So you can find them on there. This is a paper that you can get to. This was a study by Jane Anderson and Alice Muncaster, which was assessing all the data that there was from EPDs of concrete. So this is a very vast data source that could be useful in designing policy around concrete. Again, we've got some other options if you wanted to go in via a material and look at things to do with, say, steel. We've got a variety of resources on steel. So if you wanted to look at things that were, say, to do with various tools for steel, so there's been things like the innovative steel reuse toolkit for reusing of steel, some data sources, things like the global steel plant tracker to work out different techniques being used in steel making. If you were to go in via circularity, say, as a first port of call. So again, you can come back to the policy challenge page here. And circularity, we have quite a lot of resources already, but if you wanted to go in via tools, say, you could find information. So we have things like the reversible design checklist from the Buildings Material Banks project, various other circularity tools on there, things like research papers and policy briefs on circularity. So if you were to cut material resources in this way, there's various material resources on good use of circularity practices in sustainable buildings and construction in Africa. We have things like the deconstruction toolkit, which is looking at demolition versus deconstruction practices, policy lessons from a number of municipalities around the USA, different sort of roadmaps, the global perspective on sort of policy briefs for circularity. So one example here was the policy briefing here on bio-based and circular buildings from EIT Climate Kick. So this has a number of key policy recommendations in here. So I suppose one more useful example to show would be on building use again. And so this is one area you might start if you're interested in, say, resources on informal settlements. So we've started with some resources here on some case studies looking at particular informal settlements. So, for example, we have some more material-based resources on here, or you might want to go into something like municipal construction and connect to things like sustainable public procurement type policies. And so this is, we've tried to make it so you could maybe get to a good amount of resources within a couple of filters, but you could use more if you wanted to. So those are sort of some early stage user journeys. So just to show on here, we have some resources if you wanted to be more, say, regional specific. So for example, if you're looking at circularity resources and you wanted to go from research papers, you could add another filter in for different climates and try and find some practices that, say, would be good resources from, say, dry climate. So we have a circular materials report here from Nigeria. So we've populated about 200 resources at the start, and this has been through consultation with the materials group, and we are aiming to further expand the resources on the hub. We have proposed an internal review process to make sure these are impartial and good quality peer-reviewed resources. It would be very good to see an increase of free-to-access tools on the hub that can be used globally, and you don't have to be a member of the GlobalABC to submit a resource. We have the submit a resource page on the hub here, which enables anyone to put their resource forward, and it can then be reviewed for inclusion. And so Hub is aiming to support some of these approaches, and just to give a few examples of some very positive action that's been seen going forward. There is obviously a lot to do on sustainable materials, but in terms of bio-based materials, we featured some resources on the use of TIFA board, which is a very interesting material made from the cattail plant with very good thermal properties and contributes to management of that plant. With the LC3 projects, that's been something that we've seen some really interesting strides on recently, with this being featured in the Building Code of India. And things like material passports, the hub will be looking to give profiles of good data solutions. So material passports is one area that we've seen moving forward in Chile. There's one being released there, and this is the Madasta programme, which has just been released in the UK. So in terms of policies, very interested in things that will enable a good amount of data on different building types. We've seen some really good policies moving towards building codes in a number of countries, but there's still lots of building codes that don't have anything on embodied carbon in them yet. So we'd be keen that the hub can support that type of policy development. Bio-based materials is certainly one area that the hub is looking to support by showcasing some really good examples, which is the case in this online book here. But showcasing things like standards and test methods for things like earth construction and things like bamboo construction, awareness raising on other aspects of these materials so they can be used well going forward. And policies for things like deconstruction is key. So the Yale, UNEP and GlobalABC study has some really good examples of how deconstruction has really saved a huge amount of carbon compared to demolition in Montreal and Lima. On the right is some resources that were sent to me by Perks Deconstruction, a company in Denver, where there's been a lot of really interesting things happening on deconstruction and getting this into local policies there. So hopefully this is something, I think deconstruction is a very exciting area that is near the start of its journey, but something the hub is looking to advise on. So it's the end of the hub tour. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Stewart. And well done to Stewart and the team, and James and Kenya as well from our communications team at Bioregional, who worked really hard, and the huge amount of work that Mona talked about in terms of the process and all the people that have been involved to pull that together. It looks so useful. And Tom Paul has praised in the chat. And I would say that if you have any questions, we've got one more speaker and then we've got time for a bit of a discussion and to answer your questions or clarification points. Please post them in the Q&A box at the top there, or anywhere you can find, we'll find it. So now we're going to hear from Nicholas Ramirez, who is the Executive Director of the Green Building Council of Costa Rica. And Nicholas has been a leading contributor to the Sustainable Materials Working Group. And his background is a consulting engineer committed to making contributions towards market transformation in the building sector. That is what we need, Nicholas, that prioritises human well-being in the built environment for future generations. And his expertise involves new business development, stakeholder engagement, growth strategies, project management and advocacy. And Nicholas is going to give us an end user perspective from the lens of Costa Rica. Over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen so we can follow along here. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, all good.
Yes,
Nicholas.
we can.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you guys, and I'm so excited about this launch. We've been working on it for a while, as has been mentioned. It's nice to see it finally coming together with so many great resources. So we're really excited to put this to practice right away. Obviously, as from a point of view of an end user perspective, I wanted to focus on specific examples of how we will be using this here in Costa Rica, and hopefully that can be useful to others within their own local context. So first of all, I think it's important to point out that here in Costa Rica, there is a particular view towards policy in general, which probably varies from location to location. We have had a few successful policy initiatives in the past that have really marked, I think, society and their expectation or ambition that things can be done. The example I'm showing here is just one example of how policy helped to recover lost forest cover, and this is something that has generated a lot of let's say not only ambition but also faith in certain policy in Costa Rica, which helps to move things forward in a certain way. There is a kind of a yes we can attitude towards some of these things. When we first started working on this policy several decades ago, people were very worried about how that was going to affect the economy in terms of no longer having income from logging and deforestation, stuff like that. And today, sustainable tourism is generating much more jobs and revenue for the country than was ever expected for any of our, let's say, logging initiatives. So that's just one example of how this helps to move things forward and how people can expect and have faith in certain policy as they move forward. I'll very quickly go through a few main policies here in Costa Rica, things that are active right now and that I think will make very good use of the hub. First of all would be our national decarbonization plan, which is let's say not only cross sector but also a long-term plan. It spans from 2018 to 2050, and I think here it's worthwhile to mention that since there is a large focus, obviously, on low emissions, and we do have a very clean grid here in Costa Rica, so this ends up shifting our focus more quite a bit to embodied carbon in terms of materials, right? And what that upfront carbon cost is, which I think is where we are today because we've been fortunate enough to have a very clean grid, but where many other countries hope to be soon. So in this sense, I think resources like the Materials Hub can help Costa Rica, for example, be a kind of testing ground for certain kinds of policies, what kind of impact and scope they can have, and how quickly they can move the needle, let's say, towards decarbonization in certain issues. So I think this is something that will be very useful for us in implementing, first of all, this national decarbonization plan, just to give one example, right? There's also obviously the NDCs. We had some preliminary NDCs back in 2016, but the updated ones were published at the end of 2020, and these were much more specific and very focused, had strong focus on cities, buildings, and the built environment as a whole. There are 2 of the 10 strategic areas. 3 of them involve buildings. The main ones are Area 3, which is energy, and Area 4, which is, let's say, infrastructure and construction. And I think this is important because here we start to see some much more specific implementation and let's say, bringing down to metrics and actual numbers of what we need to do as a country. So here you can see just a few examples. There are several others, but I chose a few of the commitments that are from these 2 areas that I mentioned. And we do see obviously things that have lots to do with materials, right? We're seeing all kinds of, in terms of decarbonization, we have the mention of wood and other locally produced or sourced materials, and also commitments that are pretty ambitious. Maybe a little frightening sometimes for those of us that are working on this, but very ambitious. And so in this sense, we think that it does make quite a bit of sense, let's say, to have tools like the Materials Hub. But not only that, we think that the Materials Hub can be very useful, not only for the actual technical ideas of the materials themselves, but also for examples of policy making. For example, here in Costa Rica, when we're talking about locally sourced and locally produced and locally harvested, if you want to say it that way, materials, what we're a bit concerned about is how this will affect the small and medium enterprises, right? We're looking for local materials. Costa Rica, in general terms, has a tradition of importing a lot of its construction materials. We don't produce steel here, for example. We don't produce glass and several others. So the sector as a whole is very accustomed to importing lots of the materials. So we're hoping that with tools like the Materials Hub, we can get some peer-to-peer learning happening for policymakers and see what's happening in other places, see how these transitions can be made in a way that we're not leaving behind and we're actually supporting small and medium local enterprises, to say in a certain way. So that's in terms of NDCs. And we also have, at the end of June, the National Strategy for Circular Economy was launched, once again with a very strong emphasis on the built environment. The strategic axis number 5 is focused solely on circular construction and resilient infrastructure. So infrastructure starts to become a very important role in our national strategies and initiatives. Obviously, we're being Costa Rica is very susceptible to extreme climate events. So resilience has been a an increasingly important issue for us. This national strategy also puts a very strong emphasis on certifications, not only certifications of materials, but also project certification. So this is one of the first national government initiatives where we're starting to see them actually quote and mention specific certification tools. For example, cradle to cradle, lead, or edge. It doesn't specify that these are the only ones that are acceptable, but it is specified that these need to be used more broadly, and we need to use tools like these that can provide metrics for future decision making and things like that. Once again, as I mentioned, it does promote local and low footprint recycled materials, and so once again, the issue does come forward to how can we move this in line with a just transition, thinking about smaller and medium business owners. There is also a strong emphasis on using tools that can help these smaller businesses. So there is an emphasis here also on some of the tools that were mentioned, that Stewart mentioned shortly, like LC3, One-Click LCA, some of them that have some open source options. And we're trying to investigate to see which one of these can be used, and maybe do some training, let's say, initiatives through universities and other institutions here locally to make these available to different entities as we move along. Another solid example of how this can be used is the GEF8 IP11 project, which is eliminating hazardous chemicals from construction supply chains. This is being implemented in Costa Rica right now. There's an initial 4-year plan, and right now we're in the pre-implementation phases. But this will require a national baseline of hazardous chemicals that are actually present right now in our built environment. So right now in Costa Rica, as in many places in developing countries, we don't have an existing baseline of this. We don't know exactly what the volume or quantity or even what types of hazardous chemicals exist presently in our built environment. We have a pretty good idea that there's a lot of asbestos-based materials out there, that there's a lot of materials that that use different kinds of POPs, of persistent organic pollutants, and so on, which have been more recently been banned and not produced, but we know that they're present in our environment. So once again, resources like the Materials Hub, we're hoping that can help us along the way to try and get some of a better idea of what different methodologies or policies have been used to get an idea of what is existing within the built environment, and then once again, hopefully use that in the process of our project, which will include regulation to prohibit the importing, obviously, of hazardous chemicals and regulable substitutions, to promote obviously adequate alternatives, how that can be implemented, what strategies can be used for that, and also the proper. Since it is a whole the life cycle of the project that we're looking at, we also want to know what can we do with what's existing, what's already installed, how can that be dismantled in a safe way and disposed of appropriately. So, for example, I think this project in particular, it gives a very strong, a very solid example of how the user journeys that were developed within the Materials Hub were developed and how that can be useful here. Obviously, this is a different kind of use than maybe a strict policy user or a designer looking for their projects. So here, using the different user journeys that Stewart described earlier, I think we can find access, we can fairly easily access valuable resources within the hub and use them for projects like this one. Another example is the Zero Carbon Building Accelerator, which is now I'm talking about local government policy. This is a project that was implemented with 4 local municipalities, Belén, Curridabat, Moravia, and Santana. And for each of these cities, we developed a city action plan, which is like a roadmap towards a decarbonized built environment for that particular city. So there is focus within that on low footprint construction materials, what kind of incentives can be developed for sustainable projects, and so on and so forth. So this tool at the local government level, once again, the Materials Hub can help them to define how they can better prepare, let's say, their request for proposals, what incentives they give for projects that use these kinds of materials, et cetera, and also how they can maybe put a stronger emphasis on local materials or low footprint materials. And out of this project, another initiative that was born, which is in process right now, is the Municipal Sustainable Design and Construction Regulation, which the idea is here to have a regulation that will be for the sorry, local government level here in Costa Rica, not national level, and different municipalities can implement this and adjust it to their local context and their local reality, emphasizing whether issues may be more pressing for them at that time. So that's another example of how this can be used more at a local government level. Wrapping up here, I think it's very important to mention how this can support sustainable public procurement and eco-labeling initiatives. Costa Rica has been moving forward in this at a very good pace. And there are just recently, at the end of 2022, the Sustainable Public Procurement regulation was updated to include a much more broad and strict mandatory use of this regulation. Before, some of the bigger government buyers or purchasers, let's say, were not using it. Now they all have to use it. So we're going to see a much broader implementation of this, which we're hoping to have, obviously, result in greater impact. So for education processes, etc., there will be additional credit in government projects for those that use certain materials with certain certifications or certain some kind of third-party verified technical data, right? And it's worth mentioning that this aligns very well with other initiatives within the country that are focusing on eco-labeling and promoting the use of EPDs or DAPs, as they're called in Spanish. I think it's also worth mentioning, Mona mentioned in a part of the Materials Hub, another important use for this is in national taxonomies. Costa Rica is just starting on its national taxonomy for sustainable finances. The GBC has been fortunate enough to be named as the sectorial leader for construction for that policy. So we're expecting to depend very heavily on the Materials Hub in terms of seeing, once again, examples of how policy can be formulated in order to, let's say, promote incentives, right, for financial incentives or tax incentives for when sustainable materials are being used, not only at the government level, but at other levels as well. So that's the idea here. We can hopefully use these taxonomies, which are aimed at aligning, for those of you who don't know, which are aimed at aligning financial flows or flows of capital with a country's existing national commitments with the Paris Agreement, for example, in this case. So this will be a very useful tool in that sense of seeing how that can be done and how we can make sure that's embedded within the national taxonomy. And that, I'm pretty sure that'll be the case for countries that are actually updating existing taxonomies, like Colombia and Mexico here in the Latin American region. So these are just a few of the examples I want to give, as concrete examples as possible, of at least what we'll be doing here in Costa Rica and how we think the Materials Hub can support us in that sense. Thank you very much for your time.
Wow, Nicholas, I'm sure I speak for all of us when we say that's a fantastic run through how governments working with expert advocates like the Green Building Council can really integrate sustainable construction materials into policy and practice, and how one initiative leads on to another, as you said, with the city's work, and seeing how you're signposting how it can go forward. It's fantastic. So we're launching a hub today, but it's only the beginning and there's a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you,
we have had a few, well done as well. We have had a few questions and we haven't actually got very long for the webinar. So just a quick question, 2 particular points from Marquez Arazer Timotea for you, Mona. It's asked, will the hub be available in other languages? And I'm asking you because you're the United Nations Environment Programme person, so maybe you know, maybe you don't. And also, will there be any reporting metrics on the use of the hub?
I think we will have some reporting metrics that will be part of our regular reporting in the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. We usually publish a narrative report at the end of the year, and we include some statistics on the use of the website, etc. there. So that'll be included there. And then in terms of the languages, for now it's been in English. And the website of the GlobalABC is also in English. When there is a report with multiple, well, sometimes when we have an important report, for example, this materials report that was put together by the Yale team, we translated the key messages into the official languages of the UN. And so sometimes if we get a report in one language, but perhaps get key messages in different languages, we're also happy to publish that. And I would say in general, we're happy to publish reports in any languages, any of the languages, because we have a wide membership that can actually read and feed and comment on the level of valuableness of these reports. But as far as the interface of the web page, we don't have any plans for now for translating.
Okay, we're sorry about that, everyone. But that's brilliant that UNEP is able to translate those reports into all of the UN languages. Thank you. We appreciate it. There's a specific question about, are there specific topics which the hub wants to push, which perhaps I could pose to our technical expert, Stewart?
Yeah, sure. So we've discussed what some of the hot topics are, and other thoughts are. I think bio-based materials and local earth-based materials has been something that's definitely come up in our discussions. So standard development for things like earth-based materials or developing the local supply chains. I think those have been big topics. I think deconstruction is very interesting. I think data tools and sort of encouraging more EPD use or similar ways of tracking data is important. I don't know if Mona and Nicholas have any thoughts on what they think of the hot topics.
Do you have any thoughts, guys, on what you think's the great things that the hub needs to promote and push? Mona or Nicholas?
From my end, I agree. There's a large interest in bio-based materials, but I think also reports like the Yale study that just was released give very new and interesting information regarding also those hard to abate, inescapable materials that we know that we have to deal with and we have to learn how to deal with more efficiently, such as concrete and steel. So I think that goes kind of hand in hand. We need to kind of move both of those things in a parallel path moving forward. And I think, I don't know if it's just my local context that has influenced me too much, but I think there is more and more need to, let's say, connect the dots between sustainable finance and materials and how that can be used to leverage, let's say, accelerate the development of the materials we need and the wide use implementations of the ones that are proving useful.
Yeah, and
Thank
I
you,
think
Nicholas.
also,
Sorry, Mona, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the topics that we do want to promote are clear from the different pages that we have on the hub, right? So especially using a life cycle approach to building and to the selection of materials is really a key point for us. We are going forward with a material neutral approach, but also if you look under policy challenges, you see a lot of resources on embodied carbon, on circularity, as well as climate adaptation, poverty alleviation. So these are all quite important topics that we're trying to push forward and would like to be able to present more resources on these topics.
And actually on that note, Mona, I'm not sure if Mona, Stewart or Nicholas, you could comment on Tom's question, which is it discrete materials only on the hub, or is it construction elements such as roof assembly, including the suitability of application? One comment on that one?
I think there's
space. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Stewart.
No, I think I agree with you, Mona. I think it's certainly we certainly wouldn't want to be exclusive of this type of approach. You know, with being sort of appropriate climatic use of materials for roofs. Yeah, I think we would find a way to appropriately have that within the hub's filters.
Yeah, and
okay.
Previously we had talked about different parts of the envelope of a building, but then we landed on materials as they are right now, but there's absolutely space to put that in.
Fantastic. So we've reached time. Thank you very much to everyone who's worked so hard to create this hub. Thank you all for coming. And thank you all for your questions. Lots of people very excited about it in the chat there. So do use the hub and do promote it. And do send us your questions if we didn't manage to answer them all in the time allotted. And we will endeavour to answer them and keep in touch with you on this. And the presentation materials will be shared and the recording. Thank you very much.